The girl knelt in the burnt grass with her ear down close to the mouth of a wooden bucket, and she stayed there, holding still, until she had counted all the way to 60. Behind her, Docia Tharp stood with her bad hand shut inside her apron and waited. 12, Ivy said. Maybe 13. It's hard when they run together. 12 was still good. 12 meant the thing behind them was alive. Behind the two of them, banked against the low slope where the ground fell away toward the river, lay a long mound of straw and marsh hay, chest high at the crown and near 40 feet from end to end, sun-bleached on top and gone gray at the edges where the weather had got into it. From the wagon road it could have been a hay pile somebody had built badly and then forgotten, or the top of something that had been buried in a hurry. That was the joke, and the landing had made it early and stuck with it. The straw grave. It was the last week of July. The Des Moines River had gone down to a green thread between two shelves of cracked mud, and the corn on the flat had rolled its leaves shut by 9 in the morning. She was 31 years old that summer, and she had a cooper's hands, and one of them no longer closed all the way. Her father had built the shop when the landing was still 5 buildings and a ferry. Reuben Tharp had hooped barrels for the porkhouse, for the mill, for the sorghum men, and for the ice crews who came down onto the river every January and needed staves and plank and somebody who could set a hoop true. He had died in the shop with a draw knife still in his fist, and Docia had swept up around him and gone on working, because there was nothing else in her hands and nothing else she wanted in them. She had never married. The landing had a good deal to say about that, and none of it mattered as much as the other thing, which was that the porkhouse had begun buying pressed pails and stamped ware out of Chicago, and every year the order book got thinner, and every year the paper Orrin Culp held on the shop stayed exactly as thick as it had been. And there was the child. Ivy Bassett was 9. She had come to Dasha that winter, the week after her mother died, carrying a flour sack with a dress in it, and she had been at the bucket every morning since the day the pile was closed, without once being told twice. Nella had been 3 years older than Dasha, and had laughed more, and that was as much as anybody at the landing ever heard about it. The county clerk had come out once in the spring, stood in the shop door, looked at the empty racks and the thin order book, and said in a kindly voice that the poor farm at Boonesboro took children, and that no one would think badly of a woman who could not keep one. Docia had thanked him and shown him out, and then stood a long while at the bench with her good hand flat on the wood. 12 drops a minute. She wrote it on the shop wall in carpenter's pencil under the other numbers. The landing laughed at that mound all summer. And before 2 more weeks were out, that bucket would go dry, and the whole of Quimby Landing would finally get the joke it had been waiting on since February. The trouble had started the winter before, in the dead middle of January, on a morning cold enough that the sawdust in the shop stove hissed when it caught. Docia had 4 barrels finished and standing in the light by the door, white oak, 31-gallon, hoops set and driven. The porkhouse took 2, the other 2 stood there into February, and by then she understood that they were not going anywhere. Stamped ware had come to the landing. It came in on the flat of a freight wagon, a nest of pressed pails and lard cans with the seams rolled instead of hooped, light enough that a boy could carry 6, and cheap enough that the porkhouse could throw one away without doing its arithmetic over. A pail is a thing that holds lard, and those held lard. They held it for less money than the wood cost her. She went to the store on a Tuesday to ask Orrin Culp for time. Culp had kept the store at Quimby Landing for 19 years. He was a heavy, careful man who wore his collar buttoned in all weather and who had never once in his life raised his voice inside his own building. He held the paper on the cooperage because Reuben Tharp had borrowed against it in a bad year and had died before he could get out from under it. He heard her out. He did not interrupt. Then he took the note out of the drawer, laid it flat on the counter, and turned it so she could read her father's hand at the bottom of it. "I'm moving the term," he said. "It falls after harvest now. I'm bringing it to the middle of July." She asked him why. "Because Hallam's house in Keokuk is pressing me," he said, "and because I would rather take it from you in July, when there's still something in this shop worth taking, than in November, when there's nothing." He squared the paper with 2 fingers. "I've watched the coopering go for 3 years, Dokia. Your father saw it coming and he told me so himself. There's no work in it anymore. I'd sooner cut it off clean than watch you feed the last of your money into a trade that's already dead." She said the trade was not dead as long as somebody needed a thing that would hold water and not rust. Culp looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was not unkindness. "Then find me somebody who needs that," he said, "before July." She walked home along the river road in the cold with that in her hands, and the river was where she happened to be looking when the answer came. Below the ferry landing the ice crews were out. They came every winter, 40 men and 8 horses on the white shelf of the river, working in a long line with plows and one-man saws, scoring the field into a grid, then breaking the cakes free and floating them down an open channel to the elevator. They had been coming since before Dosia could walk. Reuben Tharp had sold them staves and plank and pond markers and had sent his daughter down onto the ice with the handcart to deliver them, and she had stood at the edge of that work every January of her childhood in her father's coat, watching men pack cakes into a house on the bank with a foot of chaff under them and 2 feet of marsh hay over the top, watching the whole strange business of putting a river away in a building and taking it out again in July. She knew how it was stacked. She knew how it was covered. She had known it so long that she had never once thought of it as knowing anything. She stopped in the road. She went down onto the river the next morning with her father's ice saw and a borrowed team. The crews were working the deep water above the ferry, and they let her have the shallow bend below it, which was worth nothing to them. The ice there ran a foot thick and clear as window glass, with a white seam through the middle of it. She scored it with the plow and cut it with the saw, standing over the kerf in her father's coat, working the blade with 2 hands. She got out 90 cakes in 4 days. By the 2nd day the landing had heard about it, and by the 3rd there were men on the bank, with their hands in their pockets, watching her the way people watch a barn go up crooked. "Who's going to buy winter in July?" one of them called down. She did not answer him, because the answer was every butcher and every dairy and every woman with a sick child in a hot room. Where she put it mattered more than how much she got. She chose the slope behind the cooperage, on the backside, where the ground ran off toward the river at a grade a man could feel in his knees. Her father had used the same ground for his stave piles for the same reason. Water that falls on a slope goes somewhere. Water that falls on flat ground stands and waits. She dug the bed out shallow, 2 feet down into gravel and sand, and she burrowed in more coarse gravel on top of that, until the bottom of the pit was clean stone, with nothing under it that would hold a puddle. She left the low end open so the bed drained itself into the fall of the land, and she did it with a shovel and a rake, and no pipe, and no plank, and nothing hollow anywhere near the underside of it, because the men on the ice had told her once, in the flat way men say a thing they have said 400 times, that whatever carries water out will carry air in, and that air is what eats a pile. Then she packed it. A foot of straw and marsh hay went down over the gravel, trodden even. She set the first course of cakes on edge, and drove them tight against one another with a maul, and every course after that she laid flat, one cake directly above the cake beneath it, working the chips and the chaff into every gap, so there was no daylight anywhere in that stack. Around the outside she banked another foot of straw. Over the crown she piled 2 feet, and she left the crown itself standing loose and shaggy and open to the wind, which was the part that made no sense to anybody who came to look. It took her 11 days. Ivy came out on the last 3, and carried chaff in a grain sack half her own size, and the ice went out of sight under the straw a course at a time, until there was nothing to see out there at all, but a long gray mound on a slope, with the wind moving in the top of it. The Landing named it before the week was out. Fitch at the livery called it the Straw Grave, and after that nobody at Quimby Landing called it anything else. They said Reuben Tharp's girl had buried a winter behind her shop. They said she would be digging up a mud hole in June. Culp came out once in March, stood in the road with his collar buttoned, looked at it for a while, and went away again without saying anything at all, which from him was worse. Dosia let them talk. She had one thing left to find out, and it would not answer her until the weather turned. The answer, when it came into a bucket. She made the bucket herself in an afternoon, out of shop scrap, because that was the only kind of tool she trusted. It was a piggin, a small straight-sided vessel with one stave run long for a handle, 6 inches across, and shallow enough to read at a glance, 4 hoops on it, that it did not need. She set it at the low end of the gravel bed, under the place where the bed opened into the fall of the land, and she scratched a line on the inside of it, with a nail at the depth of one morning's water. Then she taught the child to read it. 3 things, Dosia said. Only 3, and you don't have to understand any of them. Ivy sat on her heels in the wet grass with her hands on her knees. If the water's running steady, and it's clear, that's a good day. Come tell me the count, and go on to your chores. How steady? Count the drops for a minute. 8, 9, 10, that's a good day, if it's clear. And 2, if the water's dirty, if there's silt in it, or the color's gone brown, you come get me before you do anything else, and I don't care what I'm doing. Ivy nodded. She was a serious child in the way children get when they have been moved once. And 3? If the bucket's dry, Dosia said, you run. Ivy looked at the bucket, and then up at her aunt, and got it wrong in exactly the way everybody got it wrong. Dry's bad? Dry's the worst thing out here. But dry means it's not melting. Dry means it's melting somewhere I can't see it, Dosia said, and the water's got no place to go, and it's standing under all that ice in the dark, warm. She crouched down beside the girl and turned the piggin so the child could see the nail scratch. There's no such thing as a pile that doesn't melt, Ivy. It melts every day from the day you close it. That's the whole bargain. You don't stop it, you only get to choose how slow. She tipped the vessel and let the morning's water run out into the grass. So when it runs, that's the pile breathing. When it quits breathing is when you've got about a night. They came out through the spring in 1s and 2s, the way people will, and every one of them stopped at the low end, and looked down into that bucket, standing full and bright in the grass, with the water ticking into it, and every one of them said some version of the same sentence. "There goes your winter, Dosha," Fitch said it. The younger Otway boy said it. She quit correcting them by the end of April. The truth of it was too plain and too backward to carry across a fence line, that the water in the bucket was the only proof she had that the thing was working, and that the day the landing finally got the joke they wanted, the day that bucket sat empty and dry in the grass, and there was nothing running at all, she would be finished. So the bucket filled, and the numbers went up on the shop wall in pencil under one another, 9 and 10 and 9 and 10, and the ice under the straw went on quietly, doing the only thing ice knows how to do, at the rate a foot of straw and a bed of clean gravel would let it. Through February the numbers held. Into the first week of March they held. Then the spring rains came, and Dosha looked at the mud standing at the foot of her mound, and she did the one thing her whole trade had trained her to do. She built it a trough. It was good work. 2 boards ripped clean, a beveled seam, the whole thing pitched at a grade she checked twice with a level, running out from the low end of the gravel bed, and carrying the meltwater 40 feet down the slope to a soak hole she dug for it. It solved the mud. 9 days later the count was 14. She thought the child had miscounted. She went out at first light and knelt down herself with her ear at the piggin, and it was 14, and by the end of the week it was 17, and the water coming out of the trough was not the cold water of March. She put her fingers in it. It had no bite to it at all. She walked the mound twice before she understood. A trough is a hollow open thing with a slope on it, and the whole business of a hollow open thing with a slope on it is that whatever is lighter goes up it, while whatever is heavier goes down. All spring she had been drawing the warm air of the valley in under her ice, 40 feet of it, every hour of every day, straight up her own beautiful beveled seam and into the gravel bed she had built so carefully to keep air out. The men on the river had told her. They had told her in one sentence years ago, and she had heard it as a rule about pipes. She tore the trough out that afternoon with the maul, and filled the run with gravel and sand, and trod it down, and let the water go back to finding its own way through stone. The bleeding stopped. It stopped at 11, then 12, and it never went back down to 9 again all summer. She had lost something close to a fifth of the pile in 3 weeks. And July was coming, and there was not one thing she could do about the arithmetic except go back to the river and get more. It was the 28th of March. The channel had opened in the middle, and the shelf ice along the shallow bend was still there, gray now and beaded on top. She knew better. She had watched the crews come off the river a full 3 weeks before this, and she went out anyway, because the alternative was to stand in her shop in July while Orrin Culp carried her father's draw knives out the door. She got 11 cakes. On the 12th, the shelf let go under her without a sound. She went into the waist and then to the shoulders, and the cake she had been cutting came around in the current and caught her right hand against the edge of the shelf, and she felt the bones go the way you feel a green stick go in your fist. Ivy was on the bank with the sled. The girl did not scream and did not run for help. She lay flat on the shelf the way she had been told once, in another life, by her mother. And she got the handle of the ice tongs out to her aunt, and she braced her boots in the sled runners and hauled until Doshia got a forearm up onto solid ice and rolled. The 11 cakes went down the open channel while the 2 of them lay on the shelf, and neither of them turned to watch them go. They went home in the dark with the empty sled behind them. Ivy pulled it. Dosha walked with her right hand inside her coat. Two of those fingers never closed all the way again. She could hold a rake with that hand. She could not hold a draw knife, or set a hoop, or do one single thing that had ever paid her $1. Her whole trade came out of that hand, and she had spent it going back for ice. June came in wet, and then turned. By the second week the wind had gone around into the south and stayed there. Dosia was out at the mound before daylight most mornings by then, because she could not sleep well with the hand, and it was on one of those mornings that she saw the breath. It was coming off the crown. In the gray before the sun there was a slow, pale rope of vapor standing up out of the loose straw at the top of the pile. She had seen it before in April and thought nothing of it. Standing there in June, she looked at that rope of vapor and saw money going up into the sky. She closed the crown. She packed the loose straw down hard with her boots and the flat of the maul, laid a second course over it, and packed that, and then she laid boards across the whole top of the mound, edge to edge, and weighted them with stone, and she stood back at the end of it and looked at a pile that was finally sealed all the way around, top to bottom, tight as one of her own barrels. For 4 days the count came down, 12, then 11. What she had shut in with the ice was the one thing the straw could not carry. A pile of ice under cover gives off damp the entire time it is working, and that damp has to go somewhere, and the only place it had ever gone was up through the loose crown and away on the wind. With the boards on, it went up as far as the boards and stopped and hung there and came back down. By the end of the first week, the top course of straw was cold and heavy. By the end of the second it was black and matted and sour-smelling, and when Dosha put her hand into it, it packed like wet clay. Straw keeps the heat out because it is mostly still air. Soak it, and it is only mud that used to be straw. The count went to 13 and kept climbing, and she was up on the mound with a fork, trying to turn the worst of it out, when she heard the girl go under. Ivy had come around the low end to read the bucket, and she had ducked in under the eave of the mound where the straw hung out over the gravel bed, because that was the shortest way to it. The soaked mass above her let go in one piece, boards and stone and 40 bushels of wet rotten straw, and it came down into the hollow at the foot of the pile with the girl underneath it. Dosha did not remember getting off the mound. She got the boards off with the fork and the straw off with one hand, and the whole time she was doing it, she was talking. Ivy had gone down on her face in the wet chaff, with her arm folded under her. It took a long time. It was probably 90 seconds. The child came out gray with chaff stuck to her mouth and eyes, coughing hard, with her wrist already swelling, and she was crying, and she was breathing. Dosha sat down in the mud with her and held her, and the two of them stayed there a good while. She rebuilt the crown that same day, one-handed. She put dry marsh hay over the top, 2 feet of it, and she left it standing open and loose and ragged, and she cut a hole through the middle of the crown a foot across, and set a barrel with both heads knocked out into it, so the wind would always have a way through. The count came back to 12. It never came back to 9. She had 2 weeks to the note, and about 2/3 of a pile, and after that it stopped raining altogether. The note fell due in the middle of July. Culp walked out to the shop himself that morning and stood in the doorway a while, looking at the empty racks. Then he went down the slope and looked at the mound. Dosha went with him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the racks had not already said for her. What he did was take out his pencil and carry the term forward to the end of August. He told her a man does not get paid by hauling off a shop with nothing in it, and that he would rather have his money in September than a wagon load of coopering tools in July. Then the heat came on the last day of July, and it did not break for 11 days. It was the kind of weather the valley got once in a decade and talked about for 30 years afterward. The wind quit entirely. The river dropped until the ferry cable hung slack. At noon the air over the flat stood up in sheets, and the far timber swam in it. Quimby Landing began to spoil. The butcher's shed at the foot of Bridge Street went first. Milk turned between the barn and the house. 2 families in the bottom took sick in the same week, and the doctor came out from Boonesboro and said what doctors said then, which was to keep them cool and keep them drinking, and there was no way in the world to do the first of those things. And on the 3rd morning of it, Ivy came up the shop path at a dead run in her nightgown. "It's dry," she said. Dosia was at the bench. She got up so fast she knocked the stool over. "How dry?" "Dry. There's nothing in it." It was 10 minutes past 5 in the morning, and the sun was already up over the timber, and the air was already warm. Dosia went down the slope at a run with the child behind her. The piggin stood in its place with the nail scratch showing, and 4 hoops on it, and nothing inside. The grass under the mouth of the gravel bed, which had been dark and soft all summer, was pale and dry and standing up. She put her hand flat on the ground at the foot of the mound. It was warm. She knew then what had happened, because there was only one thing it could be. Somewhere in the 2 feet of gravel she had burrowed in under that ice back in February. The water had stopped getting out. The silt off the slope, most likely, washed in through the wet spring and packed by 6 months of standing weight. Willow roots off the bank, which run flat and blind and go wherever the water is. It made no difference which. The bed had closed, and the meltwater the pile had been making had nowhere left to run, and it was standing under there now in the dark, in a pool she could not see, warm as a summer creek, with every cake in that stack sitting down in it. Water carries heat into ice faster than air ever will. A pile sitting in its own meltwater in August does not last a season. It lasts a night and part of the next day. "Get the fork," she said, "and the lantern, and the barrow." Ivy was already going. To reach the gravel bed she had to open the foot of the mound. She had to pull 2 feet of packed straw off the low end, and then the banking behind it, and then dig down through the chaff and the fill until she could get at the mouth of the bed and find whatever was choking it and take it out by hand. And every minute that low end stood open in that weather, the pile lost ice. The thing that would save the ice was the same thing that was eating it. Fast cost her ice, slow cost her the whole of it. She looked up the slope at the mound, with the sun coming across it, 40 feet of gray straw, with the wind gone and the heat already coming up out of the grass, and behind her at the child standing in her nightgown, holding a lantern in the daylight. Then she set the fork in at the foot of the pile, and started to open her own winter up in the middle of an August morning. It took her 22 hours. She worked the first of it in the morning cool, and by 8 o'clock the sun was on her back, and the straw she was pulling out came off in slabs and steamed. She could get the fork in with her left hand. She could not lift a full fork that way, and would have to take half loads, which meant twice the trips, which meant twice the time, which meant twice the ice. She bound the girl's wrist to a shingle with a strip of flour sack before either of them touched a fork, and told her to stack and not to lift. Ivy stacked and lifted anyway whenever she thought she was not being watched. By 10, the low end of the mound was open to the daylight for 8 feet, and the face of the ice stood exposed in there. The cold coming off it was the first cold either of them had felt in 3 days. Ivy stood in front of it with her eyes closed and her mouth open, and did not move until she was told to. At noon, Dosia reached the gravel bed and found the water. It was standing 11 inches deep under the low end of the pile, and it was as warm as a horse trough. The stone she had burrowed in was packed solid with gray silt, and through the middle of the mass ran a mat of willow root as thick as her wrist, fine and pale, and branched out flat. She dug it out with her hands. She lay on her side in the wet chaff, with the ice dripping on her shoulder, and pulled silt and root and stone out through a gap she could barely get her arm into, and Ivy dragged it clear a double handful at a time. The bad hand did nothing. She used it as a wedge and as a rake, and by the middle of the afternoon it had split open across the knuckles, and she wrapped it in a flour sack and went back in. The heat that day, out on the open flat, was the worst of the 11. At 4 o'clock, she got the last of the root mat out, and heard the sound she had come for, which was water moving in stone. It ran out onto the pale grass in a brown flood, then clear. She did not stop to look at it. She turned around and began putting the mound back together with a fork in one hand and a 9-year-old child. They worked through the sundown and into the dark. Chaff first, packed by hand into the face of the ice so there was no daylight in it. Then straw, a foot of it, trodden. Then the banking against the outside. Then the barrel set back into the crown with both heads out, and the crown pulled down over the low end and left standing loose. At 2 in the morning, Ivy fell asleep on the straw pile with a fork in her hands, and Dosia carried her up to the house and came back down and went on alone. She closed the last of it at 4, in the dark, with the first gray showing over the timber. Then she took the lantern and went around to the middle of the mound, and she opened one small hole in the crown, an arm's length down, to see what she had left. Her hand went past straw and past chaff, and then it stopped against something flat and hard, and so cold it hurt. She stayed there a while, with her arm buried in her own straw and her forehead against the mound. Better than half, not a great deal better, whole and solid, and cold enough to burn the split skin of her knuckles. When she came back down to the low end, the piggin was ticking again. She knelt in the wet grass and put her ear to it and counted and made it 11. She sat back on her heels in the dark and laughed once, out loud. There was no one out there to hear it. Bertha Culp came up the shop path 2 days later carrying a covered basket. Her grandson was in the bottom with the fever the doctor had come out for. She stood in the shop door and did not manage the first sentence at all, and Dosia went past her and got the barrow, and did not make her manage it. They went down the slope together. Dosia opened a hole in the crown with the fork, and reached in past her elbow, and broke out a piece the size of a bread loaf, streaming and blue-white in the sunlight, and set it in Bertha Culp's basket in a nest of sawdust from her own shop floor. Bertha Culp stood in the grass at the foot of the straw grave, with that basket in both hands, and cried where anybody on the road could see her. After that there was no keeping it quiet, and by 10 o'clock there were 4 wagons in the yard. She made every one of them stand and wait while she opened one hole and closed it again properly. The butcher took the biggest piece. 2 dairymen split a load. Orrin Culp came at noon on the second day. He came at noon with the store shut behind him, which he had not done on a weekday in 19 years. He stopped at the foot of the mound and looked at the thing a long while. Then he reached up and unbuttoned his collar. He said the store had lost its whole meat account in 4 days, and then he asked her, looking at the straw and not at her, whether she would sell him ice and what she wanted for it. She told him it was the market price and not a cent over. Then he went home and hitched his own team, and he was back at the landing before 3, with his coat off and his sleeves rolled, and he hauled ice out of that mound and through Quimby Landing all that afternoon and all the next day, with his own horses and his own wagon and the sawdust of Reuben Tharp's shop floor in the bed of it. On the Friday he entered the term back to after harvest on the note in his own hand at the counter in front of 2 customers who watched him do it and said nothing. The ice ran out in the last week of August, with 8 days of hot weather still to come. That winter the shallow bend below the ferry was crowded. There were 4 mounds on 4 slopes behind Quimby Landing by the middle of February, and 3 of them were built wrong, and the men who built them came up the hill one at a time that spring to ask Dosia Tharp why theirs was running mud in April when hers had run clear. She was 32 by then and had a shop that made pond markers and sled runners and stave plank for the crews and no barrels at all, and she never in her life got that hand back. Ivy kept the bucket. She read it every morning until she was 15 years old, and long after she was grown, she would say that the strangest thing about the whole business was how the whole landing had stood there looking down into that bucket at the water running out and seen a woman losing something, when what they were looking at was the only proof anybody had that it was still there.